Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time. Today we are undertaking a critical systems-level deep dive into what is arguably the most fundamental requirement for navigating modern complexity: critical thinking. Our source material is Stella Cottrell's absolutely essential guide, Critical Thinking Skills, Effective Analysis, Argument, and Reflection. The core question we're tackling is, well, it's far more complicated than it seems. In a world just flooded with petabytes of data, sophisticated rhetoric designed to bypass our logic, and endless competing agendas, what are the fundamental measurable skills needed to consistently distinguish sound reasoning from poor reasoning? We are constantly confronted by systemic issues, from assessing complex financial risks to evaluating public health crises, and our brains often default to what the book calls automatic pilot just to cope with the sheer volume. It's an efficiency mechanism, sure, but it's a dangerous one.
It is the cognitive paradox of the modern age. It really is. When you are forced to process unprecedented amounts of information, every single day, you are compelled to rely on shortcuts, approximations, and, trusted patterns.
But those are the exact weak points.
Those shortcuts are precisely what bad actors or simply poor communicators exploit. So the goal of this deep dive isn't just a simple guide to better study habits. It's a systems analysis of how we think, how arguments are architected, and exactly where they fail. We are looking at critical thought not as some, innate characteristic that some people are born with, but as a learned, measurable, and highly structured system that demands conscious effort and practice.
So our mission is to reveal the underlying structures of reliable thought, treating thinking itself not as a magical process, but as a learned system.
To maybe set the context for the book, Stella Cottrell is an author who specializes in practical, skills-based learning, particularly for higher education. Her reach is phenomenal. She is not just an academic theorist, she provides the toolkits.
Right, the practical application.
Yes. She has published successful guides on everything from planning your dissertation and referencing and understanding plagiarism to the mature student's handbook. This portfolio really establishes her authority in the practical application and, mastery of complex intellectual tools. She bridges theory and application.
It sounds like she writes for a very specific and often, I imagine, profoundly frustrated audience. She's addressing a common pain point in the education system.
Precisely. The book is written explicitly for students, and frankly, anyone transitioning into a role that demands high-level analysis who receives that vague but damning feedback like,
more critical analysis needed.
Exactly, and they're left completely unsure what is expected. It addresses a critical systemic difficulty found in that transition to higher-level thinking.
And I find her analogy for this transition just fascinating.
It's highly illustrative, isn't it? Cottrell points out that many people come from educational or training traditions, like high school or even specialized disciplines such as certain martial arts, where you are expected to memorize texts, learn movements by rote, and demonstrate respect by copying experts precisely.
Intellectual obedience is the goal.
It is. Then you get to higher education, or these high-stakes professional environments, and they demand the exact opposite. Questioning experts, challenging published material, and doubting one's own assumptions is not just allowed, it is the fundamental expectation. This transition is so difficult because the traditional learning system rewards rote memory and speed, while the modern analytical system rewards intellectual rigor and doubt.
So the core of the problem is that we are being asked to build a completely new operating system for our brains, but we weren't given the installation instructions.
That's where the central thesis comes in. Cottrell argues, and she's building on the influential framework developed by Edward Glaser, a major contributor to educational psychology in the mid-20th century, that critical thinking is an activity that requires constant, deliberate practice. It is not a single ability, but a synergy of three essential components: attitude, knowledge, and skill.
A three-part system.
Exactly. The knowledge component is the logic, the rules of inference, and the vocabulary of argument. The skill is the ability to actually perform the formal analysis on a text or a data set, but the necessary ingredient that makes the first two useful is the attitude, the mental posture required to engage critically. The ultimate goal, Cottrell notes, is to move the user beyond passive acceptance, just taking in the information, to what she calls conscious competence, where you can apply these detailed sub-skills intentionally and reliably to entirely new, unfamiliar situations.
Okay, let's unpack this three-part Glaser framework, because it really feels like the systemic foundation of the whole book. Most people, when they hear critical thinking, they just focus on knowledge, logic puzzles or learning fallacies. But you're saying that's only 1/3 of the operational system.
Exactly. It's a common misconception. Knowledge provides the blueprint understanding concepts like validity, necessary versus sufficient conditions, and correlation versus causation. The skill is the execution, the ability to successfully break down a complex journal article or, I don't know, an impenetrable corporate memo into the claims that make it up. But the real gatekeeper, the part that most people never train, is the attitude, or what Cottrell, referencing educational psychology, calls the affective domain.
I think the biggest surprise here from many listeners is that critical thinking is, in large part, an emotional discipline.
Oh, it is entirely an emotional and psychological discipline. The source material highlights this as the natural resistance to learning to think critically. And why? Because genuine critique often challenges ideas, beliefs, or worldviews we have deeply internalized.
Things we identify with.
Yes. If a piece of evidence, say regarding the efficacy of a long-held business strategy or a political position you identify with, fundamentally contradicts your deeply held beliefs, your immediate, natural reaction is cognitive dissonance and resistance. And that's irrespective of your overall intelligence level. Learning critical thinking requires emotional self-management, the courage to let facts override your comfort zone.
So it's not about being smart. It's about being brave enough to be wrong.
In essence, yes. And that courage, it allows you to develop what's called non-dualistic thinking, which is absolutely crucial for higher level analysis. Dualistic thinking operates in comfortable, simple poles. Black and white, right and wrong, good and bad. It seeks immediate closure. It's easy, but sophisticated, complex problems like the ethics of AI development or modeling long-term economic stability, they rarely have simple binary answers. They operate on a continuum of possibilities, trade-offs, and necessary compromises. If you approach a complex problem with a strictly dualistic mindset, you cannot engage critically with nuanced evidence that might slightly contradict your starting position. Or, worse, you dismiss it as false simply because it is not 100% right.
And this is where the system of, say, social media echo chambers creates a huge obstacle. The system itself rewards dualistic black and white thinking because it simplifies complex issues into easily digestible, polarized content, which makes that effective component of critical thinking harder than ever.
It creates a feedback loop, absolutely. Dualistic thinking is comfortable, complexity is taxing. So if you operate within a system that validates your comfort and punishes complexity, your critical attitude muscle just atrophies. The ability to hold two conflicting ideas in your head, assess the evidence for both, and wait for a judgment, that is the mark of high-level critical thought, and it requires extraordinary emotional regulation.
So if critical thinking is a system we practice, then it must rely on a set of foundational, almost mechanical mental disciplines, the building blocks that we need to rehearse daily. Cottrell refers to this as developing critical muscle.
And these are the cognitive baseline skills. They are about training your attention and organization so the brain doesn't take those inaccurate shortcuts. These skills are often taught implicitly, but they need explicit, dedicated practice to become reliable.
Okay, so let's look at how we train that muscle. The first one you mentioned is focusing attention.
Focusing attention. This means training the mind to notice relevant, fine detail and patterns within the bigger picture, and perhaps more importantly, noticing what is missing. The exercises described in the source are deliberately simple. Things like visual pattern recognition, looking at nearly identical images, and finding subtle differences.
Why so simple?
Because the brain's automatic pilot looks for approximations. It tells you, these are two boxes of circles, move on. Critical thinking demands you override that approximation and actively search for the precise discrepancy.
Right. It's the difference between skimming the executive summary of a 50-page contract and actually spotting the single relevant clause buried on page 37 that changes the entire liability structure.
Exactly. The difference between seeing a politician giving a speech and noticing that the crowd is sparse, the camera angle is highly flattering, and the speaker just contradicted a point they made last week. The next core skill is categorizing and sequencing. Critical thinking requires organizing information logically. We must draw out similarities and differences reliably.
So if you're comparing two different political platforms, you can't just list their promises.
No, you must categorize them. Economic policy, environmental stance, social spending, to allow a meaningful, structured comparison. And sequencing is vital for identifying cause and effect relationships. If you can't accurately sequence the steps in a supply chain, for instance, you can't determine whether a delivery delay, let's call it A, caused a manufacturing slowdown, B, or if the manufacturing slowdown, B, caused a subsequent delay in placing orders, A. You have to structure the information chronologically and logically before you can evaluate the validity of any causal claim. Those simple categorization exercises, sorting a list of actions and objects, are the prerequisite for evaluating the complexity of a massive argument's flow.
And the final foundation feels like a bit of a lost art in our digital scrollable age. Close reading or listening.
It really is. It is the necessity of consuming information precisely, which often means consuming it slowly. Critical thinking frequently requires reading or listening in highly precise ways to make an accurate interpretation. If you misinterpret the exact claim being made, for example, mistaking profit growth slowed for the company lost money, your subsequent analysis, no matter how clever or detailed, will be fundamentally flawed.
It's built on a faulty premise from the very beginning.
Completely. The activities in Cottrell's book challenge you to determine whether a statement is true, untrue, or if the passage simply doesn't provide enough information to draw a conclusion. It really highlights the absolute importance of restricting your claims only to what is explicitly stated in the source.
Okay, so once we have those foundational skills trained, we can start to dissect the bigger structures.
Exactly. Once we have trained those foundational attention and organization skills, we can move up to dissecting the formal architecture of an argument. An argument is the mechanism of reasoned persuasion. It is not just a disagreement, it is persuasion achieved through supporting reasons that logically lead to a conclusion.
So an argument is structured like a physical building. It has a foundation, walls, and a roof. And if any part is weak, the entire structure is unstable.
Precisely. The reasons serve as the foundation, and the conclusion is the final judgment resting on them. Let's take that initial simple expedition example from the source. We have 4 propositions or reasons, like a storm prediction, danger levels, team inexperience, and a suspicion of illness.
Right.
These 4 distinct reasons lead to the singular conclusion. It isn't a good moment to launch an expedition.
That's clear. But real-world arguments, whether you're reading a scientific paper or a policy proposal, they rarely have just 4 simple reasons. They often operate like nested systems or smaller buildings supporting one massive tower.
And that's where we encounter intermediate conclusions. This is where argument architecture gets sophisticated. Strong arguments operate in layers. Minor reasons, let's say A, B, and C, are marshaled to support an intermediate or interim conclusion, which we can call reason 1. That intermediate conclusion then acts as a major reason supporting the overall conclusion. The complexity builds through these layers of proof.
Okay, give us a robust, real-world example of that layering system, maybe something beyond the multiple choice test argument in the book, so we can really see it in action.
Okay, sure. Let's imagine a policy argument for adopting a 4-day work week in a mid-sized company. The ultimate conclusion is our company should transition to a 4-day work week.
Right, the final goal.
The final goal. Now, what is the major reason supporting this? It relies on an intermediate conclusion, which is productivity will remain stable or even increase, and employee well-being will dramatically improve.
Okay, so that's a big claim in itself. It needs proof.
It does. And how is that intermediate conclusion supported? With minor reasons, the foundations. Reason A could be studies that show increased employee self-reported happiness. Reason B could be that reduced commute time leads to lower burnout rates. And reason C might be that the need to concentrate 5 days of work into 4 improves internal efficiency, reducing time wasted in long meetings.
Got it.
So reasons A, B, and C support the intermediate conclusion about productivity and well-being. That established intermediate truth then acts as the primary evidence to support the overall conclusion for the policy change. You have to evaluate the internal logic of that intermediate step before you can even think about accepting the overall conclusion. If the studies in A are flawed, the entire tower collapses.
I think this next distinction is the single most important lesson for anyone who writes reports or emails or academic papers. People provide a lot of facts, details, and signal words, and they feel like they've made an argument, but they've only produced a high-quality summary. They confuse description with analysis.
This is a deep systemic confusion. And it's partly because descriptive writing uses persuasive language and often contains conclusion signal words like therefore, consequently, on the other hand. But they lack the fundamental ingredient of a formal argument. The persuasive intent directed toward a specific, logically deduced judgment or point of view.
So what's the clearest way to distinguish between these different modes of writing?
We can break it down into 3 modes. First, explanation. An explanation accounts for why or how something occurs. It is about mechanism. The example given in the source is, the children ate the mushrooms because they looked similar to those found in supermarkets. It explains the cause-visual similarity leading to consumption. If you stop there, it's just an explanation.
Okay, that's clear.
Second, we have description. Description details the salient features, often suggesting a point of view without explicitly stating it. For instance, describing the physical features of a bridge, its height, the materials used, its traffic load. This provides the context and the features.
But that can be suggestive, right?
The problem arises when these blend. Take the example of the painting, describing how noblemen are in full sunshine while the peasants are in the shadows. That description strongly suggests an analysis of class contrast, but unless the author explicitly states, therefore, this use of light and shadow serves to argue that the artist consciously prioritized the nobility status over the working class, it remains purely descriptive.
It's leaving the conclusion up to the reader's inference, which we already know is risky.
Exactly. And finally, analytical writing is the discipline that explicitly synthesizes information, weighs the strengths and weaknesses of evidence, and then arrives at a reasoned judgment or evaluation.
And makes a call.
It makes a call. It's the movement from the bridge failed because the steel corroded due to high salinity, which is an explanation, to given the corrosive environment, the best engineering decision for the new bridge is to utilize a carbon fiber suspension system despite the higher upfront cost, because the long-term maintenance savings outweigh the initial investment. That's an analytical judgment. Analytical writing doesn't just present the facts. It uses them to justify a decision and defend it against alternatives. It's the highest level of this thinking system.
Okay, so now we transition from mapping good architecture to mapping the common flaws in our cognitive system, the vulnerabilities that make our thinking weak.
Right. We talked about automatic pilot. We have to acknowledge that the brain is supremely efficient at finding ways to save mental energy. This efficiency is necessary for processing the world, but it's precisely where weak reasoning takes root, because the brain prioritizes speed and approximation over precision and accuracy.
And that shortcut system is constantly making inferences, filling in the blanks. And that sounds highly vulnerable to what we call bias.
Inference is the essential but risky tool of communication. I mean, we can't spell out every single premise and every argument. We rely on the listener to fill in missing steps. But this necessity makes us deeply vulnerable to bias. What is obvious to one person, reflecting their cultural context, their historical experience, or their personal prejudices, may be totally opaque or even false to another, especially if salient evidence is missing.
The manager and staff example from the book really brings this to life.
It does. If you see a queue outside a shop that should have opened at 9 a.m., the common inference, the automatic pilot guess, is that the customers are desperately waiting or maybe the staff is lazy. But if you hold a piece of salient information that the manager, who has the only key to the building, is late, the inference you draw changes entirely. If the queue is now known to be the staff waiting for the manager, the problem shifts from customer service to managerial oversight. Our inferences are context-dependent and heavily swayed by our existing biases. If you generally distrust people who work in service jobs, you'll default to inferring the staff is lazy. If you have a poor opinion of corporate management, you'll quickly infer the manager is at fault. Critical thinking forces us to recognize that our initial inference is just one possibility, not a certainty, and it demands we seek the missing evidence before concluding.
It's shocking to realize that our brain is almost designed to be lazy, and critical thinking is essentially an expensive override button we just rarely push.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so if the underlying logic or the foundation of an argument is flawed, the entire persuasive system collapses, no matter how brilliantly the reasoning is structured above it. Let's start with that absolute foundation.
This is the foundation problem. False premises. Every argument is predicated or based on premises, beliefs, theories, or assumptions that the speaker takes for granted. If these foundations are unsound, factually incorrect, or simply not universally true, the argument is invalid, even if the subsequent deductive logic is flawless.
We see this all the time in predictions and planning. The structure makes sense, but the starting point is just wrong.
Take the argument that a new restaurant will be filled every night because it has a good menu and hired an expensive chef. The conclusion, a full restaurant, is predicated on the premise that a good menu and chef are sufficient conditions for success. This is a false premise.
Because there are so many other factors.
So many. Success in hospitality requires location, marketing, consistent service, pricing. A good menu is a necessary condition, but it is not a sufficient condition. The argument fails because its foundation is incomplete. Or consider a technological premise. The argument that increasing internet bandwidth and download speeds will automatically lead to better and more intelligent content consumption.
Which feels intuitive.
It feels intuitive, but it's a false premise. While speed is technically enabling, the relationship between technological capacity and intellectual quality is not causal. In fact, faster speeds often facilitate the consumption of lower quality, more addictive content. The logic about the delivery system improvements holds, but the premise about the outcome's quality is faulty.
And another gigantic structural flaw is the confusion between two events that just happen to occur simultaneously.
That is the classic persistent error of confusing cause versus correlation. Critical thinking demands that we distinguish between three types of relationships when we observe trends aligning. First, there's the true cause and effect relationship. Increased smoking causes an increased risk of lung cancer. That's causal.
Okay, straightforward.
Second, and this is where most of the confusion lies, is correlations with third causes. We noted that ice cream sales and sandal sales correlate, they rise and fall together. But neither causes the other. Both are caused by a third external variable, high summer temperatures. So if you argue that banning sandals would reduce ice cream consumption, the logic is absurd because the causation flows from the environment, not from the items themselves.
And then often we just see the third type, the false correlation.
Yes, where a correlation is assumed where none exists. The example cited by Cottrell is assuming that increased car crime is caused by a wider choice of car colors. These two trends may have risen simultaneously due to unrelated socioeconomic factors or demographic shifts, but to link the two causally is just nonsensical. Critical thinking requires us to isolate variables and ensure the link is genuine, robust, and repeatable, not merely proximate or coincidental. We have to resist the brain's automatic impulse to link things simply because they happen close to each other in time or space.
This moves us into how sophisticated rhetoric actively exploits the weaknesses in our logical evaluation system. Language, when used skillfully, can just bypass logical analysis entirely.
It's all about strategic use of language for deflection. One very common ploy is using deflection or complicity. This involves using phrases like, as we all know, or surely people like us agree that, to entice agreement and make disagreement feel socially impossible or intellectually backward.
It's designed to shame you into agreement. It makes questioning the premise feel like an act of social exclusion.
Precisely. It appeals to people like us leveraging in-group, out-group psychology. Tajfeld's work showed how effortlessly humans divide into desirable in-groups and undesirable out-groups. An author presents opponents of their argument as an undesirable out-group, say the elitists or the radicals, to ensure the audience is persuaded by the in-group views. This method uses social pressure instead of evidence.
Things like appeals to common sense.
Yes, or decency, or statements like anyone who has actually worked in the real world knows that. They're all designed to exclude the doubter. And stereotyping and association work similarly. They link an idea, a person, or a group to limited, often prejudiced traits to avoid explicit reasoning. The historical stereotype that linked doctors to men and nurses to women, for example, avoids needing to argue about actual professional competence and instead relies on deeply ingrained cultural shorthand.
And in politics, linking a new policy to freedom or tyranny.
Uses association to bypass a nuanced discussion of its mechanics and instead relies on a single, powerful, emotive word.
Okay, so what about comparisons that feel intuitively persuasive but are logically baseless? The false analogy.
The false analogy is a favorite rhetorical tool. An analogy is meant to draw out relevant similarities to aid understanding. A false analogy compares two dissimilar things to persuade emotionally, often by linking a new, unknown concept to something terrifying or positive, even if the structural relationship is non-existent.
The classic example being the cloning and Frankenstein comparison.
It's a perfect case study in deflection. Opponents of human cloning often argue it should be banned because we do not want to create Frankenstein's monsters. This comparison is profoundly flawed, both scientifically and literally. Frankenstein's monster, in Mary Shelley's novel, was a creature assembled from dead body parts. It was not a genetic copy.
And it was fictional.
And it's fictional. By ignoring the crucial differences, an assembly of parts versus cellular reproduction, and reality versus fiction, the emotional association of monster successfully distracts the audience from the actual complex biological argument about copying cells. Critical thinking demands we ask, are these two things truly comparable in the relevant ways? If not, the analogy is meaningless.
All the elegant logic in the world falls apart if the evidence supporting the reasons is weak or unreliable. So how does the academic system categorize and judge the evidence itself? It needs a robust systemic filter.
And it employs a strict reputability hierarchy. We divide evidence into primary sources, that's the raw material, raw data, original documents, eyewitness testimony, and secondary sources, which are materials written about the primary sources, like articles summarizing findings. Reputable sources like academic journal articles, reports from established professional bodies, or white papers from trusted NGOs gain their credibility primarily through peer review.
Quality control system.
It is the systematic quality control mechanism. It involves selection, criticism, and review by other leading academics in the same specialized field. It acts as a necessary filter against weak reasoning, faulty data, overgeneralization, and lack of clarity. If an argument hasn't passed this disciplinary rigor, its claims should be treated with deep skepticism.
With the massive amount of data available today, how do we evaluate the numbers themselves, especially statistics?
We have to focus on statistical pitfalls, particularly concerning sample size and statistical significance. The general rule is, the larger the sample size, the greater the probability that the outcome is statistically significant, which means it is less likely to be a coincidence. When you see notation like p equals less than 0.00001, that notation literally means the probability of this result happening by chance is less than 1 in 10,000.
And the danger is in small samples.
The danger lies in small samples and overgeneralization. While small samples may sometimes be necessary for very rare conditions, maybe a specific localized health cluster or dangerous environments like deep-sea welding, relying on a small sample to make a broad generalization is a systemic flaw. For instance, surveying 50 people on campus about university spending habits and then claiming those results represent the entire student body of 40,000 is a statistical failure of representation. You have to ensure the sample is not only large enough, but also representative of the larger population you were drawing conclusions about.
Beyond the numbers, controlling the research environment is just as vital as the sample size, right? Because real-world systems are just so messy.
Absolutely. This is the requirement of controlling for variables. Systematically isolating the cause by ensuring that only one factor is being tested. Research must account for every confounding circumstance that might affect the outcome in unintended ways.
The grapevine example from the book is perfect for this.
It illustrates how insidious these variables can be. A new grapevine produced twice the yield in South Africa. When it was moved to California for testing, with researchers carefully replicating soil type and rainfall, the controlled variables, the yield dropped. Why? The original researchers had failed to control for seemingly minor but critical environmental variables. Total daylight hours per season, specific trace elements in the original soil, the specific micropests present in South Africa but absent in California, or even the slight slope of the land which allowed for better drainage.
So they missed the real cause.
Because the researchers focused only on the obvious variables, they misattributed the massive yield difference to the vine itself, rather than to the overall unique ecosystem of its original location. Failure to control variables means you risk attributing success to the wrong business strategy, the wrong diet, or the wrong drug.
So once we've gathered and evaluated individual pieces of evidence through these filters, how do we construct a robust, comprehensive picture?
Through triangulation. This is the disciplined act of checking and comparing different sets of evidence against each other, official records, witness testimony, photos, experimental data to see if they support or contradict one another. It's a system of cross-checking. For instance, if you are investigating a historical claim, you don't rely only on the memoirs of one politician. You check those memoirs against official government minutes, contemporary newspaper accounts, and private letters.
And you have to be careful with what you're comparing.
Crucially, when triangulating, we must ensure we are comparing like with like. A head teacher claiming improved student achievement rates must be checked not only against general government records, but against similar schools in similar economic areas serving similar demographics. If the head teacher compares their school's progress to a group of schools serving much wealthier, smaller populations, the comparison is skewed and meaningless. Triangulation requires intellectual rigor in selecting appropriate comparisons.
So critical thinking is no longer an activity that's just reserved for the library. It has to extend to the massive volume of non-text formats, video, social media posts, documentaries, news clips that we consume every day.
And that requires shifting our cognitive process from passive consumption to active viewing listening. When we're reading, we naturally self-pace, we pause, we reread. Digital media consumption is designed to be seamless and fast, encouraging us to internalize without interruption. Active viewing requires actively pausing, questioning the source, and challenging the narrative structure. You have to force yourself to ask, who created this content and for what financial or political purpose? What is the cost of them telling this story?
And the visual element itself is a complex language that requires the same critical deconstruction we apply to text.
Absolutely. Visual and audio languages rely heavily on connotation and association to persuade, just like written language. The choice of background music, the sudden shift to slow motion, the specific colors used, these are all persuasive signals, not neutral facts. We have to question the structure. What information or which perspectives were intentionally omitted? Has the material been manipulated, cropped to change context, cut and resequenced to alter the flow of events, or digitally enhanced to exaggerate an emotional response?
Like in the critique of a simple presentation, the TED Talk example from the book.
Exactly. Even material presented by a certified expert in a seemingly credible format must be subjected to scrutiny regarding its persuasive ploys. Is the speaker using personal anecdotes to substitute for data? Is the visual language designed to evoke awe rather than analysis?
This brings us directly to the most toxic form of weak reasoning in the public sphere, evaluating fake news.
And we need to define fake news precisely and systematically. It is news stories that are either wholly fabricated, misconstruing established facts, or generated without any basis in reality for the purpose of deception. It is emphatically not simply news you disagree with or established belief systems, which may be challenged by new evidence, or items explicitly presented as satire or fiction.
And the causes are pretty clear.
The systemic causes are predictable. Strong vested financial or political interests, simple mischief trolling, or the highly effective desire to create a better story by exaggerating or omitting facts. The key modern element is that false information can be easily created and manipulated electronically, giving it a veneer of authenticity. The critical step for the modern learner, therefore, is systematic verification. Before sharing, pause and verify the facts with multiple, independent, reputable sources. Failure to do so has measurable impact on crucial life choices about politics, purchases, and personal health.
When we apply the lens of critical thinking to political systems, we see all the flaws we've discussed, especially assumptions and fallacies, just magnified on a public stage. Many arguments rely on unstated ideological assumptions which act as a collective blind spot for a society.
These are things that are so ingrained in a political or cultural system that they are taken for granted, making them invisible to internal critique. Think about assumptions regarding the primacy of economic growth, or historical views on gender roles in the workforce, or fundamental beliefs about whether government intervention is inherently good or inherently bad. These are unspoken premises that don't need to be stated because everyone knows it's true within that political bubble. These assumptions are the foundation of many arguments, yet they are virtually unchallengeable unless the premise itself is exposed and questioned.
So, if a politician bases an entire infrastructure plan on the premise that private industry is always more efficient than public works, that unstated premise is rarely debated, only the details of the plan itself.
Exactly. Critical thinking forces you to dig underneath the stated argument and ask, what fundamental, unproven idea must I accept for this whole argument to make sense?
And political debates are just rife with logical flaws used to justify actions, often used defensively.
Oh, yes. One of the most common defensive flaws is the two wrongs don't make a right fallacy in action. This is the attempt to deflect criticism from a current action by pointing out that an opponent or a previous regime engaged in the same or worse behavior.
The whataboutism defense.
Precisely. The source provides the example of the council leader condemned for selling public assets cheaply. The leader defends the action by pointing out that the previous opposition party also sold assets cheaply. Logically, selling public assets cheaply to secure short-term political advantage is wrong, regardless of who did it before. The unethical behavior of Party A does not make Party B's identical behavior ethical. The public debate should focus on the validity and consequences of the act now, not on past hypocrisy. Critical thinking allows us to cut through that deflection and insist that the current action be judged on its own merits and flaws.
So how do we translate this systemic understanding to daily rigor, whether we're drafting a complex business report or making a major personal decision? Where does the rubber meet the road?
It starts with the essential system of clarity. Precision in defining terms. If you are tasked with creating a strategy to improve employee satisfaction, you must first clarify the scope. Does satisfaction include compensation, career trajectory, work-life balance, or only office amenities? Defining these terms critically clarifies the scope of the problem and prevents the strategy from becoming vague or easily refuted.
Right. Terms like well-being or mental health.
Exactly. Cottrell notes that those terms are often used interchangeably in public debate, but defining them separately opens up the topic to rigorous, measurable analysis. If you define your terms loosely, your opponent can easily refute your argument by shifting the goalposts and using your vague terms against you. Precision is a structural requirement for rigor.
And once that precision is established, there's the professional discipline of communicating results with the right level of certainty.
That's the power of tentative language. This disciplined uncertainty is a hallmark of critical thought, especially in high-stakes fields like science, medicine, and engineering. Even when findings are robust, academics use tentative language. This suggests it is possible further research is needed because they acknowledge that future research, exceptions, or overlooked variables, those confounding variables we discussed, can refine or even overturn widely held views.
It's the opposite of most public discourse.
It stands in stark contrast to promotional or political rhetoric, which demands absolute certainty. We have cured X. This is the definitive answer. The critical thinker understands that certainty often ends inquiry. Tentative language, conversely, signals intellectual honesty and maintains the open system requirement of scientific progress.
And you can clearly see the failure or success of all these skills by just contrasting a strong versus a weak argument.
Yes. The comparison between sample Essay 1 and sample Essay 2 in the book on student well-being is highly illustrative of a system working versus a system failing. Essay 1 is strong. It takes a clear, informed position, it defines its key terms precisely, it groups similar points together for structural coherence, and it demonstrates wide research by triangulating multiple sources to support its claims. Essay 2, by contrast, demonstrates a lack of that critical attitude. It adopts more than one inconsistent position, it contains contradictions between its introduction and conclusion, and it makes many unsubstantiated points. Its conclusion simply does not follow logically from the reasons given, showcasing how a lack of attention to argument architecture, premise support, and internal consistency causes an argument to collapse entirely, despite the author's initial effort.
This entire analysis really confirms a core principle of our channel, that perception is often shaped less by the literal reality and more by the container, the frame in which that reality is delivered. We need to actively separate the surface message from the unstated context.
And that is the crucial difference between the denoted meaning and the connoted meaning. Denoted meaning is the objective surface message. Today, this company is launching a new electric car model. The connoted meaning carries the additional, often latent message. This car is a mark of future success. You should feel morally superior for driving this, or your neighbors will be jealous.
So critical thinking is about stripping away that connoted layer.
It forces us to pull apart the association from the argument itself. When a corporation frames its argument about layoffs as necessary right-sizing to ensure future agility, the argument is framed in positive forward-looking terms, like agility. Critical thinking demands we acknowledge the emotional connotation, but focus on the denoted meaning. The company is firing people to cut costs. The way a message is framed is often more powerful than the facts it contains because the connotation acts on our unconscious or emotional system.
And it becomes undeniable that many of our modern societal systems, marketing, litigation, political campaigning, they are not designed to optimize for truth. They are designed to optimize for persuasion, leveraging the very cognitive flaws we've discussed because these techniques are fast and highly effective at achieving outcomes.
That is the essential systemic challenge facing the critical thinker. Systems like advertising lean heavily on false analogies, emotional language appeals to complicity, and the strategic omission of unfavorable data. They achieve the desired outcome, winning the vote, selling the product faster and more reliably than slow, nuanced, evidence-based reasoning. This creates a systemic environment where arguments with high persuasive power, regardless of their logical weakness, often prevail over the arguments built with intellectual rigor.
So critical thinking is, in this context, an act of intentional cognitive resistance against highly effective systems of persuasion.
It is the only defense. It allows the individual to operate outside the default programming of systems designed to influence us by relying on our lazy, automatic pilot thinking.
We established that critical thinking requires overcoming significant emotional barriers, that natural resistance to challenging one's own deeply held beliefs. So how does an individual systematically bridge the gap between their initial confidence in their ideas and the actual competence required for rigorous analysis?
The source uses student reflective logs, like those from individuals working on complex projects, as an excellent model for internalizing this practice. The journey from automatic thinking to conscious competence requires critical self-evaluation. Initially, students might report high confidence in superficial tasks. I am great in a PowerPoint. Or feel anxiety about the core topic. I'm worried about tackling cancer
So
research.
they're focused on the surface.
The essential shift happens when they realize that their initial goals, like making a resource that looked professional and usable, actually hindered them from thinking more deeply about the conceptual, intellectual rigor of the work. They start to realize that the thought process, the rationale, and the critical development of ideas were more important than superficial goals like aesthetics. Critical self-evaluation means constantly checking one's own assumptions, acknowledging personal anxiety as a factor in analysis, and redefining goals based on deeper, more analytical understanding. The reflective log becomes an essential system of intellectual accountability, forcing the individual to treat their own thought process as a system requiring constant review and maintenance.
Okay, so to summarize the profound reframe provided by Cottrell's work, critical thinking is not about being generally smart or academically gifted. It's about mastering specific, measurable subskills, attention, categorization, and detailed argument deconstruction, and implementing disciplined habits, ruthlessly checking premises, systematically controlling for variables, and searching for underlying assumptions.
It is a practice discipline, one that can be assessed, measured, and proved through mechanical exercises and intentional self-reflection. It is not a personality trait. The moment we treat critical thinking as a system of mechanics, we gain the tools to improve it reliably.
And the ultimate skill, the pinnacle of this disciplined competence, is the consistent ability to ask the foundational questions. Where's the proof? What is the point? And does the conclusion logically and statistically add up, based only on the evidence presented?
And that questioning must be applied ruthlessly, not just to external sources like that political ad or the new study, but to one's own deeply held assumptions and beliefs, whether they are ideological, personal, or based on prior professional experience. That capacity for critical self-doubt is the engine of intellectual honesty.
This detailed analysis of the mechanics of human thought raises some critical systemic questions about how society prepares its citizens for a world saturated with persuasion. Our current educational and information systems consistently training the necessary skills of intellectual rigor and critical self-evaluation needed for the high-stakes decisions facing the modern world? What are the long-term societal consequences of allowing weak, emotive, and logically flawed reasoning to persist in public discourse when we have clearly defined tools available, as laid out by Cottrell, to promote better judgment? The gap between persuasion and truth is only as wide as our collective failure to apply these critical systems. Our deep dive today was based entirely on the book Critical Thinking Skills, Effective Analysis, Argument, and Reflection by Stella Cottrell. We encourage you, the listener, to read the book yourself. If you found the ideas valuable, please support the author by purchasing a copy or check your local library for free access. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.